Asterisk, asterisk, Part 1. The Exposition asterisk, asterisk. The town of Redemption Gulch was a place built on dust and determination. It clung to the scorched earth of the American West like a stubborn burr on a saddle blanket, a final outpost before the land gave itself over completely to red rock canyons and mountains that clawed at an unforgiving sky. The year was 1870, and the air itself felt old and tired, thick with the metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge, the ghost of gunpowder, and the warm, honest smell of horsehide and hay baking under the relentless sun. Main Street was a river of fine, ochre-colored dirt, stirred into lazy clouds by every passing wagon and weary horse. For Ilara Vance, 19 years of age, this was the entire world. Her life was a well-tended garden, enclosed by the picket fence of propriety and her father's respectable name as the town's most successful merchant. She woke each morning to the same sliver of light cutting through her starched lace curtains, casting a familiar pattern on the polished floorboards. Her days were measured in the gentle rhythms of domestic duty, mending linens with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, helping her mother plan menus that spoke of civility in a land that was anything but, and practicing the piano pieces that were meant to advertise her suitability as a wife. She was polite, demure, and obedient. The town matrons praised her posture. The eligible bachelors appraised her dowry. She was, by all accounts, a perfect daughter of Redemption Gulch. But inside, in a place no one could see, a wilderness grew. Sometimes, while her fingers moved mechanically over the ivory keys, her mind would wander past the town limits, up into the silent, watchful mountains. She imagined what it was like to sleep under a blanket of stars so thick it looked like spilled milk, to drink water straight from a mountain stream, cold and sharp against your teeth. She hungered for a silence that wasn't filled with the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of her mother's skirts. She craved a feeling she couldn't name, a color she'd never seen, a storm that would finally break the suffocating stillness of her own heart. This secret world was her only true possession, a wild, untamed country within her that stood in stark rebellion to the placid, predictable landscape of her life. Her father, a good man corseted by his own ambitions, saw her as his finest asset. Mr. Jedediah Vance had carved a small empire from dust and dry goods, and he intended to secure it through a favorable match for his only daughter. The current candidate was a Mr. Sterling, a man twice Ilara's age who smelled of cigars and self-satisfaction. He was a widower with a burgeoning cattle business and hands that, in their brief and clammy handshakes, felt possessive. He spoke not to Ilara, but asterisk at asterisk her, his words circling around topics of property, influence, and the fine home he would provide. He saw her as a beautiful piece of furniture to adorn it. "He is a practical man. Ilara," her father had said just last evening, his voice firm but not unkind. "This is not a land for poets and dreamers. It's a land for builders. Mr. Sterling is a builder." Ilara had simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the perfectly folded napkin in her lap. To argue was unthinkable. To voice the chaotic yearning in her soul would have been like speaking a foreign language, one of madness and ingratitude. So she remained silent, a lovely, well-mannered vessel, while inside, the silent scream for escape grew louder. The inciting incident, the spark that would set her inner wilderness ablaze, came on a Tuesday. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the town and bleaching the color from the sky. Ilara had been sent to the general store, her father's store, for a spool of thread, a simple errand that offered a brief illusion of freedom. The boardwalks groaned under her sensible boots, and she kept her eyes downcast, offering polite, empty smiles to the familiar faces she passed. She felt their eyes on her, the collective gaze of the town, a constant, low-grade surveillance that ensured no one strayed from their designated path. She was just stepping out of the store, the small paper-wrapped spool in her gloved hand, when he appeared. He did not ride into town with the boisterous clatter of a cowboy or the stiff formality of a rancher. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, materializing at the far end of the street as if the heat haze itself had given him form. The town seemed to hold its breath. Conversations faltered. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. He was the mountain man, a figure of local legend and fearful whispers. They said he was a half-breed, born of a white trapper and an Apache woman, belonging to neither world and therefore a threat to both. He lived alone in the high canyons, a place the townsfolk considered dangerous and godless. He was the wilderness made flesh. He was leading a single pack mule, and he walked with a long, unhurried stride that spoke of endless patience and immense strength. He wore buckskins, worn soft and dark with use, and his black hair was long, tied back from a face that looked as if it had been carved from the very rock of the mountains he called home. It was a face of sharp angles and stark beauty, weathered by sun and wind, and dominated by a pair of the darkest, most unsettling eyes Elara had ever seen. As he drew nearer, Elara found she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, a statue of starched cotton and repressed desire. The townsfolk melted away, mothers pulling their children close, men turning their backs with studied nonchalance that was thicker with meaning than any open hostility. They were leaving a wide, empty space around him, a quarantine zone of fear and prejudice. He stopped at the watering trough in front of the livery, letting his mule drink. He moved with an economy of motion, every action deliberate and necessary. There was no wasted energy, no posturing. He was simply there, a part of the landscape, as natural and untamable as a hawk circling in the sky. And then he lifted his head, and his eyes found hers. It wasn't like the looks she received from other men. Mr. Sterling's gaze was one of ownership. The young bachelors in town looked at her with a clumsy mixture of awe and calculation. The pastor looked at her soul, searching for piety. But this man, he just looked asterisk. His gaze was direct, without artifice or agenda. It was like being seen by the mountain itself, ancient, impartial, and utterly profound. It stripped away her fine dress, her careful upbringing, her family name. It bypassed the girl everyone in Redemption Gulch thought they knew and struck something deeper, that wild, secret core of her being. In his eyes, she saw not a reflection of what she was supposed to be, but a question of who she truly was. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. A hot blush crept up her neck, a wave of shame and something else, something thrilling and unknown. She should have looked away immediately. A proper lady would have. She should have lowered her eyes, turned, and hurried home, her heart fluttering with maidenly indignation. She did not. She held his gaze for a heartbeat. 2, 3, in that small eternity, a silent conversation took place. His eyes weren't aggressive, but they were challenging. They challenged the neatness of her world, the safety of her cage. They held a hint of a sorrow she couldn't comprehend and a freedom she desperately craved. It felt as though he could see the entire map of her secret longings, and instead of judging them, he simply acknowledged them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a greeting or a flirtation. It was an acknowledgement. Asterisk, I see you. Then he turned, tied his mule to the hitching post, and disappeared into the general store, her father's store. Elara finally took a breath, her lungs aching as if she'd been underwater. Her gloved hand was clenched so tightly around the spool of thread that her knuckles were white. The world rushed back in the drone of a fly, the distant shout of a child, the oppressive heat. But everything was different. The colors seemed sharper, the sounds clearer. The familiar street now looked like a stage set, flimsy and fake. The man who had just passed her was real. He was more real than anything she had ever known. She turned and began to walk home, her legs unsteady. She could feel the whispers starting up behind her, the venomous rustle of speculation. Asterisk, the Vance girl, staring at that savage. The thought should have filled her with mortification. Instead, a strange, Defiant pride flickered within her. For a few seconds, standing there in the dust under the hot sun, she had not been Jedediah Vance's daughter or Mr. Sterling's intended. She had been only herself, a woman looking at a man, and the encounter had shaken the foundations of her world. That night, she sat at her window long after the house had fallen silent. The piano music was forgotten. The mending lay untouched in its basket. She looked out past the last flickering lights of the town, toward the dark, hulking shapes of the mountains. He was out there, somewhere in that immense, mysterious darkness. He was living the life she could only dream of, a life of substance and solitude, governed by the sun and the seasons, not by clocks and conventions. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. It was the fear of the unknown, of scandal, of her father's wrath and the town's scorn. But for the first time, another feeling rose to meet it, something fierce and powerful. It was the thrill of possibility. The man with the mountain in his eyes had not invited her into his world. He had simply shown her that it existed. And now that she knew, she understood with a terrifying certainty that she could never again be content in her own. The walls of her well-tended garden had been breached, and the wild was calling. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 2, The First Collision, asterisk, asterisk. The days that followed were like a fever. The memory of the mountain man's gaze had burned itself into Elara's mind, a constant, smoldering heat beneath the placid surface of her routines. The world she had known now seemed flimsy, a painted backdrop against which she played the part of the dutiful daughter. She moved through her chores, spoke the correct pleasantries, and sat through another stifling dinner with Mr. Sterling. But her true self was far away, standing in the dusty street, caught in the gravity of a stranger's eyes. Her best friend, Clara May, noticed the change. Clara May was a girl made of ribbons and rules, her world extending no further than the latest gossip and the patterns in the dressmaker's catalog. She found Elara by the window one afternoon, staring out at the mountains with an intensity that unsettled her. "You've been quiet as a church mouse with a secret, Elara," Clara May said, her voice a cheerful chirp. "Is it Mr. Sterling? Papa says your father has nearly sealed the arrangement. Aren't you thrilled?" Elara turned from the window, forcing a smile that felt like a crack in porcelain. "Mr. Sterling is a very respectable man." "Respectable? He's as rich as Croesus." Clara May sighed, fanning herself. "You'll have the biggest house in Redemption Gulch. Think of the parties you'll host." The thought of a lifetime of hosting parties for the town's stuffy elite sent a wave of nausea through Elara. She saw a future of tight corsets and tighter smiles, a slow, comfortable suffocation. She looked at her friend kind, simple Clara May and felt a gulf open between them. Clara May saw a gilded cage and called it a palace. Elara was beginning to realize it was a cage nonetheless. "I think I need some air," Elara said abruptly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I'm going for a ride." Clara May's eyes widened. "Alone, but your mother—" "I won't go far," Elara lied, the ease of it surprising her. A seed of rebellion had taken root, and it was growing. She saddled her mare, Daisy, a gentle-tempered chestnut, with a sense of desperate purpose. As she rode down Main Street, she felt the familiar weight of the town's observation. She passed Reverend Miller, who was tending the meager petunias in front of his church. He tipped his hat, but his eyes, pale and searching, held a silent warning. He was the town's moral shepherd, and he had a keen nose for straying lambs. His look said, "Asterisk, stay on the path. Child, there are wolves beyond the fold." But for the first time, the thought of wolves was more appealing than the thought of the fold. She urged Daisy into a canter, leaving the last of the town's buildings behind. She told herself she was just stretching the mare's legs, that she was seeking relief from the oppressive heat and the even more oppressive expectations. But her compass was broken. Or perhaps It was finally working correctly. It pulled her not towards the open plains, the safe and sensible direction for a lady's ride, but towards the dark, whispering line of the woods that bordered the town to the north. This was the fringe, the dangerous territory, the place where the town's order ended and something much older began. It was his domain. The air grew cooler as she neared the trees. The scent of dust and manure gave way to the rich, damp smell of pine and earth. Here, the sun was dappled, falling in shifting patterns through the leaves. It was quieter, the town's clamor replaced by the buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen things. She slowed Daisy to a walk, her heart thrumming with a mixture of terror and anticipation. This was a transgression. She knew it. A palpable sense of crossing a forbidden boundary settled over her. The tension was broken by a sudden, ugly sound, the braying laughter of men who had drunk their wages. Just ahead, where the path curved into the trees, two cowboys were leaning against a fallen log, a half-empty bottle of whiskey passing between them. They were Gus and Pete, two hands from a nearby ranch known more for their brawling than their branding. They saw her and Gus, a big man with a cruel mouth, pushed himself to his feet, a sloppy grin spreading across his face. "Well now, look what we got here," he slurred, stepping into her path. "Little Miss Vance, all by her lonesome, lost your way. Sweetheart." Ilara's blood ran cold. She pulled back on the reins, her knuckles white. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tighter than she wanted. "I'm just passing through." "Oh, we don't mind," Gus sneered. Taking another unsteady step closer, Pete cackled behind him. "Plenty of room out here. A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be riding alone, though it ain't safe." His meaning was clear and ugly. Daisy, sensing Ilara's fear, shifted nervously, her ears twitching. Ilara tried to steer her around him, but Gus lunged, not for her, but for the horse's bridle. His sudden, drunken movement was the final straw for the mare's frayed nerves. Daisy screamed a raw, terrified sound and reared violently. The world tilted. Ilara was thrown back against the saddle, her bonnet flying from her head. She lost her grip on one of the reins and felt her foot slip from the stirrup. The horse spun, its eyes wide with panic, fighting the bit. Gus stumbled back, laughing stupidly, while Pete howled with delight at the spectacle. They saw a horse and a girl, a fine piece of sport. They didn't see the jagged rocks just off the path or the low-hanging branches that could dash her head open. Ilara clung on, her breath gone, her world reduced to a maelstrom of bucking horse and tearing panic. And then he was there. He didn't ride in, he didn't shout. He simply emerged from the shadows of the trees, as silent as a wisp of smoke. It was Silas. His presence had an immediate, chilling effect. Gus's laughter died in his throat. Pete sobered instantly, his eyes widening with a primal fear that cheap whiskey couldn't numb. The mountain man's face was a mask of cold fury, but he didn't even glance at them. His entire being was focused on the panicked horse and its rider. "Whoa now, easy, easy, girl," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones shifting in a deep riverbed. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos. He didn't speak to Ilara, he spoke to the horse, in a language of pure calm. He moved in a slow, deliberate circle, never taking his eyes off Daisy. He didn't rush. He matched his rhythm to the horse's frantic movements, becoming a point of stillness in her storm. Ilara saw him properly then, not as a fleeting figure in the street, but as a force of nature. He was leaner than she'd thought, all sinew and corded muscle beneath his buckskins. A long, faded scar sliced across one of his cheekbones, disappearing into his dark hair. It was a face that had known violence and pain, yet held a profound and unnerving peace. He murmured something else, a soft string of sounds in a language she didn't recognize. Apache, she guessed, and held out a hand, palm open. Daisy was still trembling, her sides heaving, but the frantic bucking had ceased. She watched him, her ears pricked, her nostrils flared. He took another slow step and another, until he was close enough to gently take hold of the dangling rein. He didn't yank or pull. He just held it, a firm, reassuring anchor. Slowly, the terror drained from the mare's eyes, replaced by a wary trust. Silas stroked her neck, his calloused, scarred hand moving with an impossible gentleness against her sweat-slicked coat. Only when the horse was perfectly still, breathing deeply, did he turn his attention to Alara. "You can get down now," he said. His voice, directed at her, sent a jolt through her body. She fumbled with her remaining stirrup, her limbs shaky and unresponsive. He was there in an instant, his hand closing around her forearm to steady her as she slid to the ground. His touch was brief, impersonal, yet it burned like a brand through the fabric of her sleeve. It was the first time a man had touched her with such strength, a strength that wasn't about possession, but about support. Her knees buckled as her feet hit the ground, and for a second, she leaned against him. She felt the unyielding hardness of his body, smelled the clean scent of pine, leather, and something else, something wild and uniquely his. She pulled back as if scalded, her face flaming. "Thank you," she whispered, the words sounding small and inadequate. He gave a curt nod, his attention already elsewhere. He turned to Gus and Pete, who were frozen in a state of terrified indecision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a weapon. He just looked at them, and the quiet menace in his eyes was more terrifying than any threat. It was an ancient, predatory stillness, the look of a wolf assessing two foolish sheep. "Get out," he said, the words flat and cold as river stones. They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled away, tripping over their own feet in their haste to disappear back toward the safety of the town. When they were gone, the silence they left behind was immense. It was filled with the sound of the wind in the pines and the frantic beating of Alara's own heart. Silas had turned back to her horse, running a practiced hand down Daisy's leg, checking for injury. He cared for the animal first. The thought was strangely comforting. He wasn't trying to impress her or play the hero. He was simply restoring order to his world, an order that the loud, clumsy men from her world had disrupted. "She'll be fine. Just spooked," he said, straightening up. He looked at Alara, his dark eyes assessing her now, noting her torn sleeve and the scratch on her cheek from a stray branch. I'm all right," she managed to say. "You saved me." He dismissed her gratitude with a slight shrug. "They're fools. Whiskey makes them brave and stupid." He looked back at the path leading to town. "This is no place for you." It wasn't a judgment, just a statement of fact. You are a creature of the town, and this is the wild. The two do not mix. The words should have sent her running back to the safety of her picket-fenced world. But she didn't want to run. She was standing on the precipice of everything she had ever secretly craved, and the man who embodied it was right in front of her. "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question bold and raw. He seemed surprised by it, as if the answer were too obvious to need saying. He looked at her, then at the horse, then back at her. The horse was scared, he said simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. In his world, you didn't leave a creature in distress, whether it was a horse or the woman riding it. It was a law more fundamental than any written in the town charter. He saw the world as a whole, a place of cause and effect, of respect and survival. He wasn't a savage. He was, she realized with a dizzying clarity, more civilized than anyone she had ever met. The chasm between them was immense, one of blood, of culture, of experience. He was the mountain and she was the town, and they were not supposed to meet. Yet here they were. She had a choice. She could mount her horse and ride back to her life, shaken but safe, and lock this memory away. She could forget the feel of his hand on her arm and the sound of his voice calming a storm. Or she could stay, just for a moment longer. She looked from the dark, inviting woods behind him to the dusty, sun-bleached path that led back to Redemption Gulch. She was caught between two worlds, the one she knew and the one she felt in her soul. Returning to town meant returning to Mr. Sterling, to the endless piano lessons, to the cage. Stepping forward, into the world of this quiet, scarred man, was a leap into an unknown so vast it terrified her. But it was the terror of being truly alive. She began, not knowing what she would say. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, letting the choice be entirely her own. He wasn't pulling her in or pushing her away. He was still a mountain waiting to see which way the wind would blow. And Alara Vance, for the first time in her life, had no idea. ***, Part 3. The Embers in the Gloom. ***. In the end, she did not decide with her mind. The choice was made by her feet, which carried her forward, and her hand, which reached out to accept the reins he offered. She mounted Daisy, her movements clumsy, her body still humming with the aftershock of fear and the potent proximity of him.
"Thank you, Silas,"
she said, testing his name on her tongue. It felt solid, like a stone worn smooth by a river. He simply nodded, his eyes already scanning the trees, a guardian returning to his watch. There was no farewell, no promise of another meeting. He melted back into the forest as silently as he had appeared, leaving her alone in the dappled sunlight with the scent of pine and the ghost of his touch on her arm. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a journey between two worlds. With every step Daisy took toward the familiar clapboard buildings, Alara felt the invisible corset of her life tightening again. She composed her face, smoothed her dress, and prepared the story she would tell her mother, a spooked horse, a harmless fall. The lie felt alien and yet liberating. It was the first secret she had ever kept that was entirely her own. Life resumed its suffocating rhythm, but the tune had changed. A new, dissonant chord had been struck, and it vibrated through everything. During her piano lessons, her eyes would drift to the mountains framed in the parlor window. At dinner, while Mr. Sterling droned on about cattle prices, she would remember the absolute stillness of a man who owned nothing but himself and the wilderness. The hunger, once a vague and nameless ache, now had a focus. It was a hunger to know more, to see the world through his eyes, to understand the quiet strength that emanated from him like heat from a forge. Fear warred with this new, insistent curiosity. The town saw him as a threat, a half-savage to be shunned. But she had seen him calm a terrified animal with his voice. She had felt the steadying strength of his hand. The town was wrong. 2 days later, under the pretense of gathering wildflowers for the church altar, she rode out again. This time, she pushed Daisy further, following the winding creek that snaked its way from the foothills into the deeper woods. She told herself she was being foolish, chasing a ghost. What if she found him? What would she say? What if he sent her away? The questions were a swarm of bees in her mind, but she pushed onward, drawn by an invisible thread. She found him not through searching, but through stillness. She had stopped to let Daisy drink from the creek, her own spirit flagging, when a flicker of movement caught her eye on the ridge above. It was him, standing motionless beside a towering pine, watching her. He had probably been watching her for the last half-mile. The thought wasn't frightening. It was strangely reassuring. Nothing in this wilderness happened without his knowledge. She didn't wave or call out. She simply met his distant gaze and waited. After a long moment, he turned and disappeared over the ridge. It was not a dismissal. It was an invitation. Asterisk, if you dare. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the true crossing. She tied Daisy to a low-hanging branch and began to climb, her riding skirts catching on brambles, her sensible boots slipping on the loose shale. The air grew thinner, the silence deeper. When she finally crested the ridge, breathless and disheveled, she saw it. Tucked into a small, sheltered canyon was his home. It was less a cabin and more an extension of the mountain itself, built of dark, weathered logs and stone, with a roof of packed earth from which hardy green mosses grew. A thin plume of smoke, almost invisible, rose from a stone chimney. It was a place meant to endure, not to impress. It was honest. He was waiting for her by the door, a freshly skinned rabbit in one hand and a knife in the other. He didn't smile or seem surprised. "You are a long way from your wildflowers," he said, his voice flat. I got lost," she stammered, the lie sounding childish even to her own ears. His eyes held hers, and she felt the blush creep up her neck. There was no point in pretending. "No," she corrected herself, her voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't lost." He held her gaze for another moment, then gave a slight nod, accepting her truth. "The sun will be down in an hour," he said, turning to go inside. "It is not a good place to be after dark if you do not know it." He left the door open. She hesitated for only a second before following him inside. The interior was one room, spare and clean. A narrow cot was built into one wall, covered with neatly folded furs. A rough-hewn table and a single stool stood in the center. Shelves carved into the log walls held a few pots, some dried herbs, and a small, well-worn stack of books. But the heart of the room was the stone hearth. A small, disciplined fire burned there, its flames casting a warm, dancing light on the dark wood. It was the only light, and it felt ancient and alive. It was a fire for warmth and for cooking, not for show. It was a symbol of life itself. Over the next few weeks, this became their ritual. Ilara would invent reasons to leave town errands that took her to the edge of the woods, solitary rides for her health. Her deceptions grew more elaborate, her lies more practiced. She was becoming a stranger to her family, to her friends, but she was getting closer to herself. Each time she came, Silas would be there, either working outside or waiting for her. He never asked why she came, and she never tried to explain. Words seemed clumsy and unnecessary in his world. He taught her through action. He showed her how to read the tracks of a deer in the soft earth, how to tell which berries were safe to eat and which would kill you, how to find true north by the moss on the trees. He taught her the language of silence, the art of simply sitting and observing the world without needing to impose oneself upon it. For Ilara, whose life was a constant performance, this was a revelation. With him, she didn't have to be charming or polite or accomplished. She just had to be. The first time their hands touched, it was over a lesson in fire. He was showing her how to start a flame with a bow drill, a skill he said every person should know. Her hands were clumsy, the movements awkward. He knelt beside her, his presence a solid warmth. "Your hands are too tense," he said, his voice low. "Let the wood do the work." He reached out and covered her hand with his own to guide the motion. His skin was rough, calloused, etched with the story of a hard life. Hers was soft and pale, unblemished. The contrast was a shock, a jolt of lightning that shot up her arm. She could feel the strength in his fingers, the latent power held in check. It was a purely instructional touch, yet it was the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. She forgot how to breathe. The scent of pine smoke, leather, and him filled her senses. He held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, the friction of the wood forgotten, before slowly pulling away. Neither of them spoke of it, but the air in the small cabin was suddenly thick with a new and dangerous electricity. Another time, he brought back a hawk with a broken wing. He worked with a quiet, intense focus, his large hands surprisingly deft as he splinted the delicate bone. Ilara found herself holding the bird, her fingers stroking its feathers, trying to soothe its wild, terrified heart. She watched Silas, saw the deep respect he had for the creature. He wasn't its master. He was its helper. He was mending a part of his world that had been broken. In his focused care for the injured hawk, she saw a profound tenderness that the rest of the world would never guess was there. He had wounds of his own, the long scar on his face, a slight limp she noticed when he was tired, and a darkness that sometimes flickered in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He knew what it was to be broken. Their conversations were sparse, fragments of observation. "The wind is changing, rain by morning," he might say, or he would point to a plant and name it, telling her its use both for healing and for poison. He spoke of the world as a living thing, a web of connections where every creature and plant had its purpose. She, in turn, found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. She spoke of her frustration with the piano, how the notes felt like bars in a cage. She described the suffocating feeling of being constantly watched and judged by the town. She didn't complain. She simply stated facts, and he listened without judgment, his dark eyes fixed on her face in the flickering firelight. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just listened, and in his listening, she felt heard for the first time in her life. The fire in his hearth became the symbol of their clandestine world. In its light, the strictures of Redemption Gulch and the Vance family name melted away. She was not a daughter, not a future wife, not a town asset. He was not the feared half-breed, the outcast, the savage. They were just a man and a woman, two solitary souls finding a strange comfort in the shared warmth. The flames danced and leaped, a physical manifestation of the unspoken thing growing between them, a desire for connection, for understanding, for the freedom to simply be. It was a dangerous, beautiful light in the gathering darkness of both their worlds. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 4. She had never touched a man before. Asterisk, asterisk. The sky had been a deceptive, cloudless blue when she'd left town. The lie of a sudden headache for her mother tasting less like sin and more like strategy. But the mountains kept their own counsel about the weather. By the time Elara reached the hidden canyon, the air had grown heavy and still, charged with an ominous, metallic scent. The birds had fallen silent. Silas was outside, securing a loose hide over his wood pile. He glanced up as she approached, his eyes immediately going not to her, but to the bruised, purple-gray clouds boiling over the western ridge. "You should not have come today," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be in conversation with the coming storm. "This will be a bad one." There was no time to go back. The first gust of wind hit the canyon like a physical blow, tearing at her skirts and whipping her hair across her face. The temperature dropped. A low, guttural roll of thunder echoed from the peaks, a giant waking from a long sleep. Silas simply took Daisy's reins, led the mare into a small, sturdy lean-to behind the cabin, and then gestured for Elara to get inside. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall as he shut the heavy wooden door. The sound of the world was immediately cut off, replaced by the intimate crackle of the fire in the hearth. The wind began to shriek outside, a wild and lonely sound. Rain hammered against the roof in a furious, driving rhythm. They were sealed in, an island of flickering light and warmth in a world consumed by chaos. The storm had made a decision for her that she had not been brave enough to make for herself. She would not be going home tonight. The thought sent a tremor of pure terror through her, followed by a wave of something else, something dark and thrilling. There was no escape, not from the storm, and not from the unspoken thing that had been growing between them in this small room for weeks. They ate a simple meal of smoked venison and dried berries, the silence between them deeper and more charged than ever before. The storm was their only conversation. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and every so often, a brilliant flash of lightning would illuminate the cabin for a split second, casting their faces in stark, ghostly relief, followed by a crack of thunder so violent it seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. After they ate, Silas rose to check the seals around the door and the single small window, ensuring the storm stayed outside. He moved with his usual economy of motion, but she saw a tightness in his shoulders, a slight favoring of his left side. The damp, cold air seemed to aggravate an old wound. When he was satisfied, he came back to the fire. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his head and soaked the shoulders of his buckskin shirt. He pulled it off without ceremony, the leather making a soft, sighing sound, and hung it on a peg near the hearth to dry. And then he lay down on his cot, turning onto his side to face the fire. He was stripped to the waist. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen him without his shirt before, on hot days when he was chopping wood, but only from a distance. Here, in the intimate breathing space of the cabin, with the firelight playing over him. It was different. It was terrifyingly different. The firelight licked and danced across the landscape of his back and shoulders. She saw not the smooth, unblemished skin of a town boy, but a testament written in flesh. A long, puckered scar ran diagonally across his left shoulder blade, the relic of a knife fight, perhaps. A cluster of smaller, circular scars on his side spoke of something else, a past she couldn't begin to imagine. His muscles were not the puffed-up vanity of a strong man, but the dense, functional sinew of an animal, shaped by a lifetime of pulling, climbing, and surviving. He lay perfectly still, his breathing deep and even, his eyes closed. He was not asleep. She sensed, but in a state of deep rest, conserving his energy, enduring the pain of his old injuries and the fury of the storm. Ilara sat frozen on her stool on the other side of the hearth. Her whole body was a battlefield, a lifetime of sermons from Reverend Miller, of her mother's sharp warnings about reputation and ruin, of a society that taught her that her body was a commodity, and a man's body was a danger. All of it screamed at her to look away. Asterisk. This is improper. This is a sin. This is the path to damnation. The words were a chorus of ghosts in her head. But another voice, one she was only just beginning to recognize as her own, whispered a different truth. It was a voice of profound, aching curiosity. It was a desire, not of the flesh, but of the soul. It was a desperate need to understand the man who had shown her what it was to be free. The stories she had read in books were pale, flimsy things compared to the epic written on the skin of the man lying before her, and she wanted to read it. She fought the battle for what felt like an eternity, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart a frantic drum against the roar of the storm. The fire crackled, casting its hypnotic spell. The ghosts of Redemption Gulch began to fade, their voices growing thin against the raw, undeniable reality of the man before her. He was truth. The town was the lie. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she stood up. Her legs trembled. She took one step, then another, until she was kneeling on the packed earth floor beside his cot. The warmth from the fire and from his body enveloped her. She could smell the rain on his skin, the scent of wood smoke in his hair. He did not move. He did not open his eyes, but she knew he was aware of her. He lay still, a silent offering. He was giving her a gift more precious than any jewel mister Sterling could ever buy her, the gift of absolute trust. He was giving her the power, the choice. He was letting her be free. Asterisk. She had never touched a man before. Not really, not like this. She had taken a man's arm, had her hand shaken, had endured Mr. Sterling's clammy, possessive pats, but she had never, of her own volition, with her own curiosity as her guide, reached out to explore. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. It seemed to belong to someone else, a woman braver and more reckless than she had ever dared to be. She hesitated for a final, heart-stopping second, then let her fingers graze the warm, taut skin of his shoulder. He didn't so much as flinch. The mountain man lay still, letting her explore without end. The touch was an explosion of sensation. The heat of him, the slight roughness of his skin, The solid reality of the muscle beneath it was all more real than anything she had ever felt. It was an anchor in the storm. Inside and out, her fear began to recede, replaced by a wave of reverence. Her touch was not lustful, it was questioning. Tentatively, she traced the edge of the long scar on his shoulder blade. Her fingers followed its path, feeling the story of the healed-over wound. She imagined the pain, the fight for survival that it represented. It was a mark of endurance, not of ugliness. She moved her hand to his side, her fingertips ghosting over the smaller, round scars. Each one was a mystery, a chapter of a life lived far beyond the picket fences of her understanding. She let her palm rest flat against the center of his back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, in and out. A simple, powerful cadence, the rhythm of life itself. She felt the strength there, coiled and waiting, but at this moment, it was a strength offered in complete surrender to her touch. The act was a profound and silent communion. She was learning him, not through his few words, but through the language of his existence, a language spoken by his scars, his warmth, his stillness. This was not a sin. It was the most honest prayer she had ever offered. In this small, firelit cabin, surrounded by the storm, she was breaking every rule she had ever been taught. And in breaking them, she was not falling. She was finding herself. She was stepping out of the cage of Elara Vance, the good daughter, and becoming simply Elara, a woman brave enough to reach for what she wanted to understand. The guilt was still there, a small, frightened whisper in the back of her mind, but its power was gone. It was drowned out by the roar of her own awakening heart. For how long she knelt there, she didn't know. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the sound of the rain, the crackle of the fire, and the silent story she was reading on his skin. Eventually, the fury of the storm began to subside. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh. The thunder retreated into a distant grumble, and the drumming of the rain became a gentle patter. She drew her hand back, her whole being vibrating with the intensity of the moment. The air was thick with unspoken emotion. Slowly, Silas rolled onto his back. He opened his eyes and looked at her. His gaze was dark and deep, filled not with passion or question, but with a profound and startling understanding. He had been with her through the whole journey. He had felt her fear, her hesitation, her curiosity, and her reverence. He lifted his own hand, the one with the calloused skin and the story of his own labors, and gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking away a single tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. No words were spoken. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, in the glowing embers of the fire, a new world had been born between them, forged not by a promise, but by a touch. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 5. The Secret Unraveled, asterisk, asterisk. The world, washed clean by the storm, looked painfully bright as Elara rode back into Redemption Gulch the next morning. Every detail the sharp edge of a roof against the clear blue sky, the glint of sun on a window pane. The deep ruts in the muddy street seemed etched with a new and startling clarity. She felt as if she were seeing it all for the first time, or perhaps the last. She was a stranger here now, a traveler returned from a foreign country, bearing a secret passport in her soul. Her excuse for her night's absence, that she had been caught by the storm and taken shelter in an old, abandoned line shack, was flimsy at best. Her mother's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line, her eyes scanning Elara's disheveled state, the stray twig in her hair, the strange, luminous calm in her daughter's eyes that looked nothing like the aftermath of a frightening ordeal. "An abandoned shack alone, Elara. Have you taken leave of your senses?" her mother, Beatrice, demanded, her voice a sharp staccato of disapproval. "Your father and I were beside ourselves with worry." "I am safe, Mother. That is all that matters," Elara replied. her voice steady. The Alara of a week ago would have stammered, apologized, and wept with shame. This new Alara simply met her mother's gaze, and in doing so, created the first true fissure in their relationship. Her father, Jedediah, was more concerned with appearances. "This is not good," he muttered, pacing the parlor. "A young woman of your standing, unaccounted for overnight. Tongues will wag." He was right. The town was a tinderbox of piety and suspicion, and a single spark was all it needed to burn a reputation to the ground. The spark had already been lit. Gus and Pete, the drunken cowboys Silas had chased away, had nursed their wounded pride with more whiskey and loose talk. They'd seen Miss Vance, the merchant's pretty, untouchable daughter, riding toward the woods where the half-breed lived. Then the storm had hit. The conclusion, for minds steeped in malice and boredom, was as simple as it was damning. The whispers started as a low hum beneath the normal clatter of town life. Alara felt them in the way eyes slid away from hers as she passed. She heard them in the sudden silence that fell when she entered the general store. Her friend, Clara May, was the first to give the whispers a voice.
"People are saying the most awful things. Alara,"
she said, her own eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination.
"They're saying you weren't in any line shack.
They're saying you were with him, the man from the mountains." Each word was a stone, and Alara felt the weight of them, the cruel bruises they were meant to leave. She wanted to confide in Clara May, to try and explain the truth, a truth far more profound and complex than the town's crude imaginings. But looking at her friend's face, she saw only a reflection of the town's small, fearful mind. Clara May couldn't possibly understand. No one could. The rumors reached the ears of Mr. Sterling, and he descended upon the Vance household like a bird of prey. The self-satisfied suitor was gone, replaced by a man whose ownership had been challenged. He smelled of cigars and fury. He cornered Alara in the parlor while her parents stood by, wringing their hands. "I am a man of considerable standing," Sterling began, his voice dangerously low. "My wife's name must be beyond reproach. These rumors are an embarrassment."
"They are lies,"
Alara said, her voice colder than she knew she possessed. "Are they?" Sterling's eyes narrowed, sweeping over her with an insulting appraisal. "You have been distracted, riding out alone against your father's wishes. Now this, whether they are lies or not, is irrelevant. People believe them." He took a step closer. "When you are my wife, there will be no more solitary rides. You will learn that your actions reflect upon me. I am purchasing your father's business connections, and I am purchasing a respectable name. I expect to get what I pay for." The raw commercialism of his words, the ugly reduction of her entire being to a line item in a ledger, ignited a fire in Alara's chest. For the first time, she saw him not as a boring old man, but as a monster of a different sort, one who would not chain her body, but would own her very soul. She looked past him to her father, her eyes pleading for him to intervene, to defend his daughter's honor. But Jedediah Vance merely stared at the floor, his face a mask of grim calculation. He was weighing his daughter against his business, his ambition against his love, and ambition was winning. In that moment, Alara knew she was truly alone. That afternoon, she fled. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to escape the suffocating walls of her home. She went to the only place she could think of, the creek at the edge of town, the boundary line between the world that was trying to smother her and the world where she had begun to breathe. The water, swollen and muddy from the storm, rushed over the smooth stones. It was a place of transition, belonging neither fully to the tamed lands of Redemption Gulch nor to the untamed wilderness of the mountains. It was like her. She knelt at its edge and stared down at her reflection. She saw the girl the town saw Alara Vance, her hair neatly pinned, her face pale with distress, her fine dress a mockery of her inner turmoil. But as she looked deeper, the reflection seemed to shimmer and change beneath that respectable surface. She saw another woman, a woman kneeling in the dark by a fire, her hand tracing the story of a man's life on his skin, her heart alive with a feeling so powerful it defied names. One was a reflection of duty, the other a reflection of desire. One was a ghost, the other was becoming real. She loved Silas. The realization was not a gentle dawning. It was a physical blow, a truth so absolute and terrifying it stole her breath. It wasn't just fascination or gratitude. It was love, a love for his quiet strength, his gentle hands, his sorrowful eyes, his profound connection to the living world. She loved him for the freedom he embodied and the freedom he had awakened in her, and in the face of that love, the demands of her family and the threats of Mr. Sterling became nothing more than noise. The choice was no longer about which man she would have. It was about which life she would lead. She could let the reflection of the dutiful daughter pull her under, marrying Sterling to save her family's name, and slowly drown in a sea of polite misery. Or she could turn her back on the water, on the town, and walk toward the mountains, toward a future that was wild, uncertain, and terrifying, but true. Her reverie was broken by the sound of her father's voice. He had followed her. "Elara," his tone was weary, stripped of its usual bluster. He looked old. "Mister, Sterling is a forgiving man. He is willing to overlook this unpleasantness. If we act swiftly, he wants the wedding date moved up to next month." "No," she said, the word leaving her lips before she had consciously formed it. It was a small sound, but it held the unshakable weight of her newfound certainty. Her father's face hardened. "That is not a choice you have. I have given my word. The contracts are drawn. You are a Vance. You will do your duty to this family. You will marry him, and you will put an end to this scandal. You will forget this foolishness." "It is not foolishness," she said, rising to her feet to face him. She saw the creek rushing between them, a torrent separating two worlds that could never again meet. "It is the only thing in my life that has ever felt real." "Real," he scoffed, his voice rising in disbelief. "A life of comfort, of security, a good name that is not real. You would throw that away for a half-breed who lives in a mud hut, a savage who is hated and feared by every decent person in this territory. He has bewitched you." "He has not bewitched me," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He has seen me." Jedediah stared at her, truly seeing his daughter for the first time not as a reflection of himself, but as a stranger, a willful and defiant woman he did not recognize. The ultimatum was laid bare. "You will announce your engagement at the Sunday service this week," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will stand by Mr. Sterling's side, and you will smile, and you will never, ever go near those woods again. This is my final word." He turned and walked away, his back rigid with the authority he believed he still possessed. Elara remained by the rushing water, the sound of it filling the silence. The river flowed in only one direction away from the town and up toward the mountains. Her father had given his final word, but she, too, had found hers. She looked at her reflection one last time, no longer seeing two women, but one, a woman who had made a choice. Now, she just had to find the courage to survive it. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 6. The climax, asterisk, asterisk. Sunday dawned heavy and breathless, the air thick with unspoken ultimatums. Elara was dressed in her finest Sunday dress, a pale blue creation of starched cotton and lace that felt like a burial shroud. Her mother fussed around her, pulling at the ribbons, her face a tight mask of anxiety. Her father stood by the door, his pocket watch in hand, a silent, ticking time bomb. They were waiting to march her to church, to the pew beside Mr. Sterling, to the public sealing of her fate. Every sound in the house was amplified, the solemn ticking of the grandfather clock, the rustle of her mother's silk dress, the sharp, impatient snap of her father closing his watch. To Elara, it was the sound of a cage door swinging shut. She had spent the night staring into the darkness, her heart a cold, hard knot of resolve. She would not go. She would not stand beside that man. She would not speak the lie. She didn't know what would happen when she refused, but she knew that yielding was a death of a different kind. She was drawing the breath to speak the first word of her rebellion when a new sound intruded from outside. It began as a low murmur, the sound of angry bees, then swelled into distinct shouts. A horse galloped past on the street, its hooves sucking at the mud, followed by the heavy tread of running boots. Her father frowned, his carefully constructed Sunday peace disturbed. "What is the meaning of this?" he muttered, pulling back the lace curtain. His body went rigid. "Good Lord," he whispered. A wave of cold dread washed over Elara. She pushed past him to the window. What she saw stole the air from her lungs. A mob was forming in the street. It was a motley collection of townsmen, ranch hands, shopkeepers, men she had known her entire life, but their faces were twisted into a single, ugly mask of self-righteous fury. They carried rifles and shotguns, and some even held torches that looked obscene and foolish in the bright morning light. At their head, puffed up with authority, sat Mr. Sterling on a fine black horse. Beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable but carried along by the tide, was the town sheriff, a man whose authority was clearly second to Sterling's wealth.
What is happening?
Beatrice Vance cried, her hand flying to her throat. Just then, a breathless boy from the general store ran up to their porch. "Mr. Vance, Mr. Vance! It's the half-breed Mr. Sterling found out he's been squatting on the old Tanner Creek land, the plot Mr. Sterling just bought the deed for. He's formed a posse to run him off. They say he's a trespasser and a danger to the town." The lie was so audacious, so perfectly crafted. It was almost brilliant. A land dispute, a legal, defensible reason to persecute a man they already hated. But Elara knew the truth. This wasn't about land. This was about her. This was Sterling's revenge, his brutal, public way of eradicating his rival and punishing her defiance. The whispers and rumors had been the kindling. Her rejection of him had been the spark. Now he was fanning the flames, using the town's fear and prejudice as his weapon.
"This is madness,"
her father said, his face pale. "This will bring violence." But Elara saw past the immediate danger to the deeper cause. This was her fault, her secret visits, her love, her rebellion. They had led the wolves to his door. While she had been wrestling with her own fears in the comfort of her home, the consequences were about to fall on him. A primal, protective instinct she never knew she possessed surged through her. "No?" she whispered. She turned from the window, her eyes blazing. "You will stay in this house," her father commanded, seeing the wild look on her face. "This is men's business. It has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," she said, her voice ringing with a strange new power. She started for the door. He blocked her path, his body a wall of parental authority. "I forbid it. Elara, think of your name. Think of your family." She looked at her father, at the man who would sacrifice her for a business deal, who would stand by and watch an innocent man be hunted to protect his own fragile notion of order, and she felt the last thread of filial duty snap. "His name is Silas," she said, her voice shaking with a cold, clear rage. "And he is a better man than any of you. I will not let you do this." For the first time in her life, she disobeyed a direct command. She pushed past him. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Elara!" She wrenched her arm free and ran, out the door, down the porch steps, into the muddy street. She heard her mother scream her name, a thin, despairing cry that was swallowed by the roar of the mob. She ran, her fine blue dress becoming splattered with mud, the carefully arranged ribbons coming undone. the rules and restrictions of her entire life unraveling with every stride. The mob was moving toward the edge of town, toward the creek, the symbolic border between their world and his. She pushed her way through the stragglers, ignoring their shocked, angry faces. They were a single beast, driven by a single mind, and Sterling was its voice. "He's a menace," Sterling was shouting, his voice carrying over the crowd. "He's trespassed on my land, and he has poisoned this town with his degenerate influence. We are here to uphold the law and protect our community. We will drive the savage back to the rocks he crawled out from." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. They had reached the creek, and they stood there, a line of armed men, staring into the silent, watchful woods on the other side. They were an army of civilization, preparing to invade the wilderness. And then the wilderness answered. Silas did not cower in his cabin to be surrounded. He did not try to flee. He emerged from the trees, stepping into the open on the far side of the creek. He moved with that same unnerving calm, as if he were walking into a discussion, not a lynching. He held a simple hunting rifle, but he held it loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. It was not a threat. It was merely a part of him, like an extension of his arm. He stopped at the edge of the water, his dark eyes sweeping over the faces of the men who had come to hunt him, his gaze finally settling on Sterling. He was outnumbered 50-1, and he showed no fear. The moment was electric. The shouts of the mob died away, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Nature and society. The man of the mountain and the men of the town faced each other across the rushing water. Just as Sterling opened his mouth to shout an order, Alara broke through the final line of men and stumbled into the open space between them. "Stop!" she cried, her voice raw and desperate. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of triumphant rage, contorted with disbelief and fury at the sight of her. Her father, who had followed her, stood at the edge of the crowd, his face ashen. "Alara," Sterling snarled. "Get back from there. This is no place for a lady." "It is exactly the place for me," she said, planting her feet in the soft earth, positioning herself directly between the mob and Silas. She turned to face the men she had known her whole life.
You should all be ashamed.
"He's a trespasser," someone yelled. "He is not," Alara countered, her voice gaining strength. "That land has been his home for years. This isn't about a deed bought yesterday. This is about hate, and it's about him," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Sterling. "This is not about the law. This is his petty revenge because I would not have him." The accusation, so public and so raw, struck the crowd like a physical blow. Men shifted uncomfortably, looking at Sterling, then back at the mud-splattered girl in the fine dress. Her words held the undeniable ring of truth. "She's hysterical," Sterling shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "The savage has twisted her mind."
He has done nothing of the sort,
Alara declared, turning now to fully face the town, her back to Silas, a human shield.
This man, who you call a savage, saved me from men from this town. He showed me nothing but decency and respect. He has more honor in one of his scars than you have in your entire fat, greedy body.
Mr. Sterling, humiliated, enraged, stripped of his righteous pretext before the entire town, Sterling lost control. The thin veneer of civilization cracked, and the brute beneath was revealed. With a roar of pure fury, he raised his rifle. "Silence her!" It happened in a blur of motion. Silas, who had been watching with a stoic calm, moved with the speed of a striking snake. He did not run. He did not attack. He lunged forward, across the shallow creek, his only thought to get to her, to shield her with his own body. His movement startled the tense, frightened men. Someone, lost in the mob mentality, panicked. A single shot cracked through the air, sharp and definitive. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Alara felt a powerful force slam into her.
throwing her to the ground. It was Silas. He had reached her just as the shot was fired, tackling her into the mud, covering her body with his. For a terrifying second, she thought he had been killed. Then she felt his weight shift, heard him grunt with pain. He pushed himself up slowly, and she saw the dark, wet stain spreading rapidly across the shoulder of his buckskin shirt. The sight of his blood, the result of their blind hatred, shocked the mob into a horrified stillness. The single rifle shot had shattered their collective fury, leaving only a sickening individual guilt in its place. They looked at the bleeding man, at the terrified girl, at their own guns, as if seeing them for the first time. Elara scrambled to her knees. She saw the pain in Silas's eyes, but she also saw the fierce, protective fire still burning there. His first concern was still for her. In that instant, her old life was burned away to ash. She looked up at the stunned faces of the townspeople, at her father, who stood frozen with horror, and she felt nothing but a vast, sorrowful distance. They were strangers. This the mud, the blood, the man beside her. This was her reality now. Without a second thought, she reached down and tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her fine lace petticoat. The sound of the ripping fabric was the sound of her final, irrevocable choice. She pressed the white cloth against his wound, the material instantly turning a brilliant, shocking crimson. She met Silas's eyes, and in their depths, she saw a question. Asterisk, are you sure, asterisk? Her answer was not in words. She put her arm around him, taking his weight, and helped him to his feet. Then, without a single look back at the town, at her family, at the entire world she was leaving behind, she turned and began to help him walk back toward the shelter of the woods. The crowd parted for them, silent and ashamed. They watched as the merchant's daughter, her blue dress ruined, her hands stained with blood, led the wounded mountain man back into the wilderness, leaving their world of rules and rumors behind forever. The cost was immense, but for the first time in her life, Elara Vance was truly free. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 7. The Reckoning and the Resolve. Asterisk, asterisk. The sanctuary of the woods was immediate and absolute. The moment the first thicket of pine and aspen closed behind them, the angry sounds of Redemption Gulch faded, replaced by the gentle sigh of the wind and the frantic drumming of Elara's own heart. Silas leaned heavily on her, each step a carefully controlled agony. The crimson stain on her makeshift bandage was growing. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she ruthlessly pushed it down. There was no room for the vapors and hysterics of a town lady. That girl was gone, left behind in the mud by the creek. The woman who remained had a singular, all-consuming purpose to get him home. The journey to the hidden canyon, a path she had once navigated with a thrill-seeker's excitement, was now a grueling test of endurance. She took most of his weight, her muscles screaming in protest. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by grunts of pain he could not entirely suppress. He guided her with single words, left, watch the stone. Easy, his knowledge of the terrain so ingrained it was instinctual. It was her strength and his knowledge, a desperate partnership forged in blood. When they finally stumbled into the clearing in front of his cabin, Elara was trembling with exhaustion. She helped him through the door and onto his narrow cot. He collapsed onto the furs, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes closed against a wave of pain. For a moment, she stood frozen in the center of the room, the full, terrifying weight of her decision crashing down on her. She was alone, miles from everything she had ever known, with a wounded man whose life was now in her hands. The silence of the cabin was absolute. There was no one to call for, no one to help. Then his voice, a ragged whisper, cut through her panic. The water bucket and the small leather pouch on the shelf, the one tied with green. His words were an anchor, a task. She moved, her actions clumsy at first, then more certain. She brought the cool water and a clean rag. She found the pouch, which contained dried leaves of yarrow and a small, hard cake of pine pitch soap. "The shirt," he rasped. With trembling fingers, she worked the buttons of his good shirt, the one he wore to town, and then helped him cut away the sleeve and the blood-soaked buckskin shirt beneath. The wound was a ragged, angry tear in the muscle of his shoulder, bleeding sluggishly. It was ugly and terrifying, but her revulsion was eclipsed by a fierce, protective focus. He guided her through the process, his voice low and steady despite the pain that tightened his jaw. She washed the wound as gently as she could. He instructed her to chew a wad of the yarrow leaves into a poultice, a trick he said he learned from his mother, and apply it directly to the injury to stop the bleeding and fight infection. She did it without hesitation, the bitter, earthy taste flooding her mouth. As she worked, she saw him not as a symbol of freedom or a romantic figure, but as a vulnerable man of flesh and blood. The body she had once touched with such hesitant reverence was now entrusted to her care in its moment of deepest weakness. This intimacy was not of desire, but of survival. It was more profound, more binding, than any kiss could ever be. The next few days blurred into a cycle of tending the fire, fetching fresh water, changing his dressing, and forcing him to drink the bitter herbal teas he instructed her to brew. She learned to move with a quiet efficiency that would have shocked her mother. She learned to bank the fire so it would last through the night, to recognize the different bird calls that signaled safety or intrusion, to live by the rhythm of the sun and the needs of a healing body. In his fevered sleep, he sometimes spoke fragmented words in English and the soft, flowing sounds of the Apache tongue. She heard names *Taza, Nalin *, and saw expressions of old grief and pain flit across his face. She sat by his side in the firelight, wiping his brow, offering him water and guarding his rest, feeling the vast, untold history of his life surrounding them in the small cabin. On the third day, the fever broke. He woke in the late afternoon, his eyes clear for the first time. He watched her for a long moment as she stirred a pot of thin broth over the fire. "You are still here," he said, his voice weak but steady. "I am still here," she answered, not turning around. "You should have gone back," he murmured. "They will have closed their doors to you forever." "Their doors were the walls of a prison," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not going back." A long silence settled between them. She brought him a cup of broth and helped him sit up to drink. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the cup, and the simple, fleeting touch was filled with a universe of unspoken gratitude. He drank, his eyes never leaving her face. He was seeing the woman who had knelt in the mud and defied a mob, the woman who had chewed bitter herbs and cleaned his wound without flaking. He was seeing the person she had become. The outside world did not intrude, but she felt its echoes. She wondered about her parents, imagining her mother's tears and her father's cold, silent fury. She thought of Mr. Sterling, his public humiliation a far greater wound than the one Silas now bore. The town, she knew, would be in turmoil, a hive buzzing with scandal and recrimination. What she didn't know was that the hive was already beginning to change. The sight of her defiant stand, of Silas's quiet courage, and Sterling's naked brutality had left a deep and unsettling impression. Reverend Miller delivered a sermon not on sin, but on the dangers of mob justice and bearing false witness. His eyes lingering on the empty Vance and Sterling pews, the sheriff, deeply ashamed of his own weakness, quietly launched an investigation that consisted of him telling everyone involved to go home and mind their own affairs. And one morning, Elara found a small basket just inside the tree line, on the path she used to take from the town. It was filled with a loaf of fresh bread, a wedge of cheese, clean linen bandages, and a small jar of her mother's blackberry preserves. There was no note. It was an anonymous offering, a quiet act of complicity. Someone in Redemption Gulch, perhaps more than one, did not condemn her.
It was a small crack in the wall of their judgment, a fragile ray of light. She wept when she found it, not from sorrow, but from a complex gratitude that a part of her old world had reached out not to reclaim her, but to support her in the new one. As Silas began to heal, a new, comfortable domesticity settled into the cabin. He taught her how to properly fletch an arrow, his hands guiding hers. She read to him from his small collection of books, Shakespeare, a worn book of poetry, a naturalist's journal, her voice filling the quiet spaces. In these quiet moments, she came to a full understanding of what she had done. Her love for Silas was the catalyst, the spark, but the choice she had made was for herself. It was not merely a romantic escape. It was a conscious, deliberate act of self-emancipation. She had chosen justice over prejudice, truth over hypocrisy, a life of difficult substance over one of comfortable illusion. She realized her attraction to him had never been just about his rugged handsomeness or the thrilling danger he represented. It was about the integrity of his existence. He lived in harmony with a set of laws far more ancient and honest than the petty bylaws of Redemption Gulch. He respected life, took only what he needed, and moved through the world with a quiet confidence that came not from what he owned, but from who he was. To love him was to choose that same integrity for herself. One evening, as he sat by the fire carving a piece of wood, she found the courage to ask, "The scars on your side," she said softly. "What are they from?" He stopped carving, his hands going still. He looked into the fire, his face shadowed and distant. "My father was a white trapper," he began, his voice low. "He thought he could live in both worlds. He was wrong. When I was a boy, a group of soldiers came to our camp. They did not see a man with his family. They saw a race traitor and his Apache squaw. My mother, she died protecting me. My father fought. He died, too, the soldiers. They left me for dead." He touched his side. A reminder that a man who belongs nowhere must be strong enough to make his own place. The story settled in the small cabin, filling it with the weight of a sorrow so immense Alara could barely comprehend it. She finally understood the deep well of sadness she had always seen in his eyes. He was not just an outcast by choice, he had been made one by a brutal act of violence. His solitude was not a rejection of the world, but a shield against its cruelty. She did not offer him pity. She moved from her stool, knelt before him, and took his face in her hands. She met his gaze, and, for the first time, she did not see a mysterious mountain man. She saw Silas, a man who had endured the unthinkable and had not been broken, but had instead forged a life of honor and peace in the heart of the wilderness. "You are not a man who belongs nowhere," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that was deeper than desire, stronger than passion. "You have made your place, and if you will have me, I would like to make it my place, too." Her love for him was no longer a secret, rebellious fire. It was the calm, steady, and life-giving warmth of the hearth at the center of her new world. It was the conscious choice to stand with a good man against a bad world, and in doing so, to build a better one, just for the two of them. Asterisk, asterisk, part seod, the horizon asterisk, asterisk. His silence, after her declaration, was as vast and deep as the wilderness outside. He did not immediately answer. Instead, he reached out and took the hand she held against his cheek, his calloused fingers lacing through her own. He studied their joined hands in the firelight, one dark and scarred, the other pale and, until recently, unblemished. They were a map of two different worlds, now irrevocably intertwined. "Your world is gone, Alara," he said, his voice low and gravelly, not as a warning, but as a final, solemn acknowledgement of the price she had paid. "There is no road back." "I don't want a road back," she whispered, her gaze unwavering. "I only want the trail forward." A change occurred in his eyes, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of his soul. The deep, guarded sorrow that had always lived there did not vanish.
but it made room for something new, a fragile, unpracticed light. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of such profound and gentle reverence that it felt more binding than any vow spoken before a preacher. "The trail forward," he repeated, the words a quiet oath. Together. The weeks that followed were a season of rebirth. As the last of the summer wildflowers faded and the aspens on the high slopes began to burnish into gold, Silas's strength returned. His wound healed, leaving a new scar to add to the story of his life. But this one was different. It was a scar she had tended, a wound they had shared. Ilara, too, was transformed. The ghost of the merchant's daughter was fully exorcised, burned away by the fire of her choice. She had arrived in the canyon a frightened girl in a fine dress. She became a woman of the mountains. Silas taught her to hunt, not with a rifle, but with a bow, a skill that required patience, silence, and a deep respect for the animal that would give its life for theirs. She learned to track, to read the subtle language of a broken twig or a faint depression in the earth. Her hands, once soft from piano keys and needlepoint, grew calloused and capable. She found a strength in her body she never knew she possessed, a resilience that came from true purpose, not from social posturing. She did not miss her old life. At times, a fleeting memory would surface, the scent of her mother's rosewater, the chime of the grandfather clock, and it would feel like a scene from someone else's story, a book she had read long ago. The gilded cage of Redemption Gulch had been replaced by the vast, open freedom of the wilderness. And while it was a harder life, it was an honest one. Here, survival depended not on your name or your dowry, but on your skill, your courage, and your partnership. Their love was not a thing of breathless proclamations or flowery poetry. It was a quiet, sturdy structure they built together, day by day. It was in the way he would bring her a rare, perfect eagle feather he found on a high ridge. It was in the way she would mend a tear in his buckskins with stitches that were now strong and practical, not invisibly fine. It was in the comfortable silence they could share for hours, sitting by the fire, each knowing the other's thoughts without the need for clumsy words. It was a love forged in respect, tempered in crisis, and grounded in the shared, simple reality of their life. One evening, as the first chill of autumn began to creep into the canyon, Silas looked up from the arrow he was straightening. "They know about this place now," he said, his statement hanging in the quiet air. "Sterling, the others, it is no longer hidden." Ilara understood immediately. Their sanctuary had been breached, even though the town left them alone. The knowledge of their location was a lingering poison. They were still defined by their proximity to Redemption Gulch, a satellite to a world they had rejected. True freedom, they both knew, lay not in defiance, but in disappearance, in finding a place that was entirely their own, a place that wasn't a reaction to the past, but the foundation of a future. "Where will we go?" she asked, her heart giving a small, excited leap, not with fear, but with anticipation. "West," he said, his eyes turning to the unseen horizon beyond the canyon walls. "Across the Great Divide, I have heard stories of valleys green as a new leaf, where the water runs clear and the game is plentiful, a place a man could build a new life. A man, he meant, and a woman." The decision was made. The days that followed were filled with practical, purposeful preparation. They packed not with sentiment, but with ruthless efficiency. Ilara took nothing of her old life except for the small, sharp knife she now wore at her belt, the fine dresses, the sensible boots. The very memory of what she had been all were left behind. She now wore supple deerskin leggings and a tunic Silas had helped her craft, clothes made for movement and endurance. Their provisions were sparse smoked meat, dried berries, a pouch of cornmeal, salt. Their wealth consisted of 2 sturdy horses, a pack mule, his rifle, her bow, 2 good knives, and the knowledge in their heads
It was more than enough. On the morning of their departure, Elara took one last walk to the edge of the woods overlooking the town. From her vantage point, Redemption Gulch looked like a child's collection of wooden blocks, small and insignificant against the vastness of the landscape. She could see the steeple of Reverend Miller's church, the roof of her father's store, the solid, imposing shape of the house she had once called home. She felt a pang, not of regret, but of a deep, sorrowful ache for the parents she had lost, and for the girl they had lost in her. She knew she had broken their hearts, but she also knew that to stay would have been to break her own soul. She whispered a silent goodbye, a prayer for their peace, and turned away without a second glance. As she walked back to the cabin, she found one last basket at the tree line. This one contained a small, heavy sack of coins and a thick wool blanket. Tucked inside was a single, perfect blackberry preserve, just like the first one. She knew, with a certainty that brought tears to her eyes, who it was from. It was not a plea to return. It was a blessing for the journey, her mother's final, secret act of love. She took the blanket, but left the coins. They had no use for that kind of currency where they were going. They left the cabin as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange, deep violet, and impossible gold. Silas had swept the hearth clean, leaving the small home just as he had found it, a simple, honest shelter waiting for the next soul who might need it. He helped her onto her horse, his hands strong and sure at her waist. He mounted his own, and for a moment they sat side by side, looking not back at the canyon they were leaving, but forward, at the rugged, unknown peaks that stood between them and their future. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and the coming cold of a mountain night. It was a lonely, wild sound, but she no longer feared it. The world ahead of them was filled with danger, with hardship, with the profound solitude of the frontier. There would be storms and hunger, blizzards and bears, sickness and doubt. There were no guarantees of safety or comfort. But as she looked at Silas, at the quiet resolve in his profile outlined against the glorious, dying light of the sun, she knew she was not alone. He turned to her, and his eyes, once filled with a sorrow she couldn't comprehend, now held the reflection of the sunset, and of her. He offered her a small, rare smile, a smile that reached his eyes and spoke of a peace he had finally found. Their promise to each other was not spoken. It was in the set of their shoulders, in the shared direction of their gaze, in the simple, profound fact that they were riding into this vast, beautiful, and dangerous world together. Love, she had learned, was not about finding a safe harbor. It was about finding the courage to leave the harbor and navigate the storm with another soul you trusted more than yourself. True freedom was not the absence of walls, but the bravery to build a life on your own terms, guided by the compass of your own heart. They nudged their horses forward, their figures slowly shrinking into the magnificent, sprawling tapestry of the American West. Two small specks of hope and defiance heading toward the horizon, toward a place they would call home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. We invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and give it some extra support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.